Shifting timelines. We are getting new information on just how long President Trump was actually in talks about building that Trump Tower in Moscow, according to his very own lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and it is a lot longer than the president had originally acknowledged. During an interview with the New York Times, Giuliani quoted Trump as saying, quote, "The Trump Tower Moscow discussions were going on from the day I announced to the day I won." Well, previously, former Trump fixer Michael Cohen testified to Congress that Team Trump had conversations about the tower project only up until about January of 2016. Now, it is very important because at that time, Trump was publicly denying having anything to do with Russia. So let's take a quick look at President Trump's relationship with the Russian President Vladimir Putin as laid out in recent reporting. We're going to start on July 7th, 2017 in Hamburg, Germany, the G20 summit, the site of the first face-to-face meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. That morning, you may recall, the New York Times reached out to the White House for comment on a story about Donald Trump Jr. and senior campaign officials meeting with Russians during the campaign in Trump Tower here in New York. Remember this timing as we look at how events unfolded in Germany, because around the same time in Hamburg, in the afternoon, President Trump and his then Secretary of State met with Vladimir Putin and the Russian foreign minister for more than 2 hours. Now, after that meeting, the president confiscated his interpreter's notes, giving an order not to reveal what was discussed in that private meeting. That is information that we now know thanks to the Washington Post and its reporting. Well, later that evening, the president sought out Putin, meeting privately with him and the Russian government interpreter without any other Americans present. Video of the event shows the president gesturing towards Putin during that dinner. You see it there, waving his hand in an apparent, you and me kind of motion, pumping his fist, something we've all seen when the president does rallies or when he's on tarmacs with his supporters. Now, the very next day aboard Air Force One, the president reportedly dictated his son's misleading response to the Times' reporting. Don Jr. said at the meeting they, quote, primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children. All right, so days later, the Times obtained emails between Trump Jr. and a British publicist setting up the meeting, an exchange that offered dirt on Hillary Clinton, to which Don Jr. said, "If it's what you say, I love it." Okay, more than a week later, the New York Times interviewed the president himself and was asked about the mystery meeting between Trump and Putin back in Germany. The president said, quote, "It was not a long conversation, but it was, could be 15 minutes, just talked about things. Actually, it was very interesting. We talked about adoption." All right, so the president then even tried to brush aside concern about that Trump Tower meeting, saying, quote, "I think most politicians, I was just with a lot of people. They said, who wouldn't have taken a meeting like that?" So joining me now is Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor. Jill, great to have you with us. So let's talk a little bit about the significance of all of this. Does it matter that Rudy Giuliani, the president's own lawyer, is now once again moving the goalposts when it comes to how long the president and Michael Cohen were talking supposedly about this Trump Tower project meeting? Earlier on, we were saying it was January of 2016. We are now talking about almost 11 months later.
Well, let's look at the basic fact, which is that from the beginning, there have been lies. Both Don Jr. and candidate Trump and then President Trump denied that there was any business in Moscow. They had no business there. They didn't care about it. They didn't want to do it there. So they lied from the very beginning about having any business at all. Now the timeline is longer, so the lie goes even longer. And the importance of it is, number one, it explains why he has treated Putin in the way he has. He is greedy. He had a deal that would have been the biggest of his lifetime, and he wanted the money. And now we have to question, well, if it went up until the election, is it going on still now? Is he still working to try to monetize his presidency? We know he is, in terms of violating the emoluments clause, which means he's profiting from being the president. So these are all very important facts.
Let me ask you about another interesting fact that seems to have emerged over the weekend thanks to Rudy Giuliani making another admission on the Sunday shows that Trump may have actually talked to Michael Cohen about his congressional testimony. That in of itself is pretty significant in the wake of the BuzzFeed report that claims President Trump was a little bit more forceful in directing Cohen to lie to Congress about the Moscow project. Listen to this.
He's pleading guilty to get a reduced sentence, which means he's saying what the prosecutor wants him to say.
But you just acknowledged that President Trump might have talked to him about his testimony.
And so what if he talked to him
is it
about
not?
So what if he talked to him about it? Help us understand that. Giuliani says, as far as he knows, Trump didn't tell him to lie about it, but it may have been okay to talk about it. And the thing that jumps out at me is I think of when, that big conversation he had with Jim Comey saying, I hope you can let the Michael Flynn thing go. It's not a direct order, but it can be interpreted as a directive of sorts.
Yes, of course, the detail of the conversation matters, the exact words used, the intent of the speaker, and how the person listening heard it. And when it's the President of the United States, you hear things differently. So the exact words matter, but it's ridiculous for him to say it doesn't matter. No defense lawyer would ever tell or even allow a client who is under investigation to talk to a principal witness against him. Yes, it may not be illegal to talk, but it sure doesn't pass the smell test. It's a very bad thing. And given the history of President Trump and his pressure on witnesses, it does look like it could be witness intimidation, which is just adding another crime to the potentials for indictment if you were to proceed with indictment or for impeachment.
Of course, we'll learn more when Michael Cohen goes to Capitol Hill to make that testimony to the House of Representatives in February.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.